If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and explorers of haunted, abandoned places, what was your scariest and most horrifying paranormal encounter? Share the stories that gave you nightmares. Yesterday I met up with 3 friends in my countryside school's arbor. We talked a bit, and when I had to go home at 10 p.m. while they stayed and were telling scary stories to each other, white van, UFO, and men in suits. Later on, at 12 a.m., they went home, with 2 of the friends in the same direction. The street lights go off at 11 p.m. as they were going home through a small road going through our small village, a single one-lane road with houses on each side. They stumbled upon one of a few old wooden abandoned houses with a connection to big local fields. They saw odd candle-like lights coming from behind the house. They got spooked, of course, due to scary stories, no lights, and of course the weird ritual like lightning from behind the house. The next day my parents let me stay for an hour longer, so we met up and just chit-chatted. At some point near 10 p.m., where it was pretty dark, we heard a very creepy, surreal noise that sounded either like some monster, an old barn closing, or someone crashing a car. We ignore it and mind our own business. Later on, near 11 p.m., we head to the said house for the excitement and to see those lights again. This time those were absent. However, we heard weird noises from inside that sounded like hitting a bag of concrete or beating the sheets. We get spooked, but I decided to take some pictures because, why not? At some point we heard something in the grass, so we ran off. We came back a few minutes ago just to not hear anything this time. We were wondering what the hell was that, and after a minute of snooping, we heard some doors opening in the shack. We got so scared shitless that we just went back home. I got information from a friend's long-dead grandma that the house is haunted. I checked the photos I made, and one of them got a very creepy red hue. I like to go ghost hunting just to see if stuff was real. There was a spot where a 2-lane road was raised up to make for train tracks. But the road was really too skinny and you couldn't see over the top, so there were head-on collisions all the time. It was a side road that went through the forest but was sort of busy because it connected 2 main areas. It was a GD death trap. I'm not even sure it had gates for when trains were coming. People would say they see weird stuff at night, so we went to check it out. We walked into the forest near it. We got to about 60 feet away from the road. There was a floating blue orb crackling like electricity. It was about 1 foot in diameter, floating about 5 feet off the ground, about 15 feet away from a group of 4 of us, and 12 feet away from the tracks. All of us saw it. We looked at each other and looked back, still there. It stayed the same size and elevation but slowly moved around. It lasted about 2 to 3 minutes. We stayed 15 feet away but moved around at probably 180 degrees just to make sure what we were seeing was real and couldn't be from another source. It came a little closer to us and then just sank into the ground. We were hoping to see a ghost, we hadn't anticipated an orb. Never heard of that before. I am no stranger to the paranormal, I've been experiencing things my entire life, but this is something I can't quite figure out. I've lived in my house for about a year and a half, and it's no secret that the house is haunted / a paranormal hotspot considering that it was built in the early 1920s and is 100 years old. My partner and I love everything paranormal, and we often go ghost hunting and do things like the Estes method to communicate with spirits and capture evidence. But since we started doing it in the house, we always eventually end up connecting with this thing that lives outside the house. It never gives us a name or any identifying details, it only says things like come see, come outside, come here, go outside, and come look, which is creepy as hell. But it also seems to only be interested in me coming outside. It's not interested in my partner or anyone else that investigates with us coming out of the house. Last night was probably the creepiest experience we've had with it so far. When I was younger, I experimented with automatic writing since I'm fairly sensitive to paranormal things, and so we decided to both try it last night, and the responses were really creepy. There were 2 other non-threatening spirits that came through as well. I mostly just want any insight or advice as to what the hell this thing is. It feels really old, like it's been here a long time, and why it's interested in me specifically. Last summer I was fortunate enough to be able to go on an investigation at the Missouri State Penitentiary, and it was a blast. I don't know the specific tour I went on, as I wasn't in charge of booking it, but we got to go through several of the buildings and had a couple of encounters as well. The first encounter was in the showers of one of the holding areas. Our guide lit up a cat ball and tossed it into the shower, and it lit up a shadow onto the wall of the shower, which was so cool to see. The second encounter was much more intense. We were in the death row section of the prison, in a basement, and our guide was trying to get some of the spirits there to show themselves, and they wouldn't. So to draw them out, our guide began to talk about something unrelated to the tour, and we looked toward the end of the hallway toward the only source of light, and a shadow figure began to slowly creep out from behind the wall leading around to the other side of death row. It was such a surreal experience to see that. I don't know how many people will end up seeing this, but if you read through it, I can 100% recommend MOSP. I'll be at the Sally house soon and am so excited to be staying the night there. I've always been interested in the paranormal since I was young. Me and my friends got into abandoned houses and schools but never encountered anything paranormal until that one time 6 years ago. There was an allegedly haunted hospital in my area, and many rumors suggested that it's extremely haunted. Me and my friend decided to go and check it out one day and decided to go at 1 in the morning as a challenge. The first thing that hit us when we entered the hospital was the chilly atmosphere, even though it was summer. We walked all the way to the stairs, which led us to the first floor. We walked around the huge hospital and found nothing out of the ordinary until we reached the 3rd floor. It was cold, and I mean really cold. We walked around until we reached an empty room with one dusty bed in the middle. I had a chill run down my spine when I saw the black shadow hovering toward me. It was tall and had no features whatsoever. I turned around and headed to the door. My friend was right behind me and didn't have the chance to react when the dark shadow entered his body. I was shocked and horrified by what would happen to him. He froze for a minute and didn't move a muscle until I called his name, asking if he's all right. I will never forget what occurred at that moment. He started screaming, banging his head against the wall like a madman. I hurried to stop him, but he overpowered me and continued screaming in my face with 2 voices coming out of his mouth. It was like something was inside him screaming with him. I still have nightmares of the sound to this day. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped and fell face first to the ground. I was relieved and went to hold him and get the duck out of there. When he started shouting again, I didn't have any choice but to sit next to him and wait until he calmed down. What happened next was one of the most intense moments in my life. I was sitting there while 4 cats sat next to my friend staring at me. I swear it's like they were staring into my soul, and I was ready to die at any moment. I wanted to just run, but I couldn't leave my friend there. I decided to beg the cats to spare us and promise to never come back. I just had no choice. Suddenly my friend stood up and started walking to the exit by himself while kicking and punching everything around him. I was relieved and started making my way to the exit while keeping my distance from the aggressive person ahead of me. When we made it to the exit, my friend collapsed and started crying and sobbing hysterically. After he calmed down, he told me that he was boiled alive the entire time. Every time I tried to touch him, it caused an extreme burning sensation for 15 minutes, and I couldn't do anything about it. Since that day, I still suffer from nightmares and keep seeing shadows from the corner of my eye. It was the worst choice of my life, and I will never under any circumstances go into an abandoned building again. Years ago, a friend and I went to do some ghost hunting in this small cemetery tucked back in this small patch of woods in town. There doesn't seem to be any driveway for the cemetery anymore, so I had to walk down to the school and cut through the woods there, then across a field to the gap in the tree line on the back side of the cemetery. We get there after about a half-hour walk. We had 3 digital voice recorders and 1 cheap digital camera. We got there and set up 1 recorder with me as I walked around the back side of the cemetery, 1 with my friend as he walked up by the war memorial in the front, and 1 in the center on a headstone that had been pushed over by a group of kids years ago, one of those kids being my cousin. So as I'm walking around, I was speaking loud enough to be heard on my DVR and the 1 in the middle, and I said, "I'd like to apologize for what my cousin did here. It wasn't right what they did vandalizing this place," and on playback later on, my DVR had no response, but the 1 in the center on that headstone was the only thing we caught in the 6 hours we recorded. In response to my apology was a woman saying, "Hi Devin." Devin is the name of that cousin who vandalized that cemetery. I live on the East Coast, so the cemeteries are ancient, 1700s plus. Me and a group of friends went to a local cemetery and decided to do some light, no equipment, just our phone flashlights, ghost hunting. Nothing too eventful happened for the first half an hour as we walked around the soldier memorials. We crossed an old limestone bridge with a little creek underneath. As we started to leave the memorials, I said goodbye, and people started to feel dizzy/weak in the knees with pressure in the back of their head/upper neck. A few even felt really tired afterward. So we went on a little further. The couple of the group decided to split off, so me and 2 others were going to the oldest section of the cemetery, and a girl kept hearing her name called and kept going ahead of us. After we all regrouped and talked over everything that happened, the other guy in the group pulled his necklace off to give it to his girlfriend and found out it was spinning without his hand or arm moving. I personally held his arm and felt his hand. It was not moving. It spun for about a minute, then started making an X shape and then slowly died out. After that, nothing happened to me/my group. However, The couple said that they were hearing people calling them into the woods / into an area without roads or any buildings for miles. Needless to say, they thought we were playing with them, but we were on opposite sides of the cemetery entirely. Just yesterday I was talking to a girl from the group, and she said that at home she heard the same voices, plus screaming and people knocking on her door. Today I found out she's in jail. What do I do? Should we go back to the cemetery and apologize? Should we just forget it happened? During college, my friend and I got really into ghost hunting and, like normal college kids, would spend our Friday and Saturday nights at the local cemetery, in Salt Lake, Utah. I had downloaded a ghost box app that I assumed was BS but thought it could be fun, but the first time we used it, we kept hearing the same names and things over and over again, as if the same people were trying to tell us their story. One of the names we kept hearing was Tom, and we kept hearing something along the lines of him being lost and wondering where his parents were. We also both had the feeling that this Tom was a younger boy that had died young. The next day, we went back and were just looking at the headstones and found one for a boy named Thomas who was only 5 or so when he died, and there was an inscription that said in memory of our son. I'm sure it was just a crazy coincidence, but it definitely freaked us out, and we continued to check in on Tom whenever we went back. There's a lot of weird things happening in my town. Let me get started with this. A few years back, my friends and I were joking around and said we should go hunting for the paranormal. We grabbed an audio recorder and a night vision camera, then left the house. First we went to the cemetery. It was around 12 a.m. We asked questions and did the usual ghost hunting stuff you see on TV. With no luck, we tried where the old state hospital used to be before it got torn down, nothing there either. We gave up around 2 a.m. We started packing our stuff up, then I remembered, there was an abandoned house set out in the woods by my house. I told my friends, we packed up and set out towards the woods. We reached the woods around 2:50. It was a 10-minute walk from there. Once we got to the house, we unpacked our equipment, and then I noticed there was a low light coming from the inside of the house. My friends thought someone lived there, so they were eager to leave. I said no, it's probably a homeless guy, so we went creeping into the house. Making sure we were quiet, we opened the door up and crept in. This is where it gets interesting. Once we got inside, we heard chanting, not one but multiple voices. I got chills up my spine. We sat there listening for a few minutes, then I peeked around the corner. I saw about 6 people surrounded by candles and dark robes. I went to turn around, and I accidentally kicked it wall. It made a loud thunder, so my friends and I hurried up and got out of there. We left our stuff and ran all the way back to my house. They say this town is magical, but I didn't believe them till that night. Hopefully whoever they were chanting to wasn't evil. I kind of grew up in unstable housing. I traveled around a lot and became a hitchhiker when I was like 18. I once made some friends with native kids that live on a reservation close to Nevada. There was an abandoned cabin right at the edge of the reservation that had a dirt floor. Me and my friends would often smoke weed in that little rundown cabin. The cabin had a very chill, friendly vibe and often felt warm. One day I had special permission to sleep in that cabin because there was a particularly bad storm and my friends did not want to sleep outside in my tent. I had a weird but happy dream that night that I cannot recall. When I woke up, there were big dog footprints. The biggest dog footprints I've ever seen all around me on the dirt. Like the footprints were in a complete, unbroken circle, and I couldn't see where they began or left the circle. Right next to my head when I laid on my backpack was a wedding ring. I kept that wedding ring for many years because I always felt like it was a gift. I don't know what lived in that cabin, but it was very happy, and if I'm ever back in that area, I would like to leave it a gift as well, but I was never sure what I should bring. Considered to be one of the most haunted places in Northern Ireland, I can agree with this wholeheartedly. It was shortly after 9 p.m. on a Saturday night, and there were 5 of us doing a paranormal investigation. At one point, 3 team members went further on into the abandoned and extremely dilapidated building as myself and a female team member continued with our spirit box session. On numerous occasions, profanities were coming through the spirit box, telling us to get it. Calls for help, along with male and female voices as well as children's voices, also came through. We stood in a long, dark oak-paneled living room, lounge. I've been to forests and other outdoor locations camping alone in the dead of night, and the darkness I was witnessing at this location was dense with a sinister vibe to it. It wasn't long before I was overcome with distinct feelings of being surrounded, being watched, and a deep feeling that I shouldn't be there. I admit that I felt unsettled. I fought to take back control of myself and continued to do what I was there for. I asked the other investigator how she felt, and she told me that she didn't like the feeling of the place. That she had the feeling of being watched. I did not tell her how I felt, but instead I took out my digital camera and began to walk around snapping random pictures using the flash. At one point I walked out of the room, torch and camera at hand, scanning what little I could see through the heavy darkness of my surroundings and treading carefully on the dangerously rotted wooden floor beneath my feet that I didn't want to fall through. Looking over at the other investigator, I told myself that if she needed help, I would return to her immediately. I gingerly made my way along the winding corridor, snapping pictures with my flash camera. In the distance, some 50 meters, around 165 feet, away down the corridor, I saw the beams of flashlights and heard the voices of the other investigators. I stopped at a short corridor that led into a room, snapped a picture, and I was about to move to my left to what I thought was another corridor to snap a photograph when I distinctly heard wet footsteps approach me from within the area. I froze on the spot, heart racing, calling out to the other 3 investigators, thinking, hoping, that it was one of them, to soon discover to my horror that it wasn't. The hairs on my body stood. I backed off a few paces and pointed the camera at the entrance, waiting. Something had intentionally made itself known to me. I felt challenged. I called out to the other team members, telling them what had just happened as I walked closer to discover that the entrance actually led into a lift. The kind of lift found in hospitals. And it was empty. Later, I discovered that someone had opened a diary book box at this location. This must have been around 2007. One night, 2 friends and I were out ghost hunting in a very remote little town in western NY. My friend Jane wanted a couple more pictures in the old cemetery, so her boyfriend and I waited in my SUV while she did her thing. It must have been around midnight, and we were parked on a back road, but there were some street lights up ahead. Jane was behind us and off to the right, but we could still see her and her flashlight. John and I happened to be looking up the road when, about 50 to 65 yards ahead, out from under the streetlight on the left-hand side, appeared a black figure in a wide brim. He just appeared. It was blacker than black, more like a void. 100% it was not a person. This being had absolutely no features, but we could make out the hat from the profile. It was a flat top hat with a wide brim around it. On my mother's grave, it took maybe 30 steps before it morphed, the only way I can describe it, into a black cat before it reached the street light on the opposite side of the road and disappeared into a field. Again, you could tell it was the shape of a cat, but it was just a black void. John and I stared at each other for about 2 minutes before we could even speak. When the time came, all he could say was, "You saw that too, didn't you?" We continued to sit there in absolute awe and sheer terror. Jane came back not long after, and I couldn't even move to unlock the doors. I was able to move my hand just enough to hit the unlock button and let her back in. She jokingly said, "You both look like you saw the devil himself." John was a huge guy, very tall, muscular, and intimidating. I looked back over, and he was shaking and in tears. All he could say was "cat." I tried to explain to Jane what had happened, but I struggled to even talk. It was about a 35-minute drive back home, and I can remember Jane saying things like, "This isn't funny anymore. You guys are scaring me." John insisted we take him to his church, where we both said a prayer to Mother Mary at the outdoor statue. While he continued to pray, I tried to explain to Jane what we had seen. I remember telling her and thinking how crazy I sounded. To this day, it still gives me a chill in my core. Whatever it was not of this earth, is all I know. A part of me wants answers so badly, but then I keep thinking maybe I'm better off not knowing exactly what it was. Jane and I lost touch over the years but did reconnect eventually. We talked about that night, as it was always the elephant in the room. She told me that following that incident, all of the crosses in her mom's house would randomly turn upside down for a couple weeks after this happened to us. It only stopped when Jane's mom went around the house very deep in prayer and blessed it. Jane and John lived with her at the time. Did something follow them home? I've never seen anything like that again, and I pray I never will. I have been chasing ghosts, entities, and demons now and again. And in all that time, I have never had an attachment to me of any kind. After all these years, never one. The title says my ghosts. I have 3, one is a small girl, we think could be 7-ish, in a bright dress and blonde hair. She is mischievous, she likes to mess with our cats, too. The other we have only seen a few times, my wife continues to feel his presence, though we do not see him. This ghost prefers to be outside, walking past windows. Scared the living crap out of my wife. The other one is a shadow person, I have seen her several times, she is always in our hallway. Just standing there. The first time I saw her, we met eye to eye. I said, "Your move," and she faded away. None of these ones frighten or scare us, that takes a lot to scare us. Recently I have seen a new one, he is a shadow that moves quickly, near me, past me, reflected in the window at me. But I have never met it face to face. When I moved to Surprise, Arizona, 12 years ago, if you told me we would have ghosts, I would have said, I do hope so. And I guess be careful of what you ask for. This male figure seems very familiar, yet not. I know that sounds nuts. I have been thinking about it since I first noticed it. My mom is in late stage dementia. It's day to day, of course. But I can't shake the feeling that I know this entity. Well, anyway, yes, even the hunter is sometimes hunted. We all hope it is not a nasty attachment, and if it is, we will just have to throw it out. Happy haunting. I have done some ghost hunting and still, upon occasion, like to seek out the paranormal. And boy did I find exactly what I was looking for one night. There were rumors about a house in a neighboring town that was so scary that nobody ever made it completely through except one person, and he is now in an insane asylum. Once I found out where the house was, my buddy and I loaded up in a car and took off to go check it out. We got there just as it was getting dark. The house was a 2-story home, but it was big. No wonder nobody made it completely through. It would take a couple hours if you wanted to explore and look for anything interesting. The house was obviously old. It was a light blue, but the paint was chipping off, and it just looked like an abandoned house. A lot of the windows were boarded up. Some windows still had the glass, and some windows were broken. We walked up to the porch and found the front door to be unlocked. No surprise because the window closest to the door was broken, and it would have been really easy to break in. We opened the door and stepped inside. I was expecting to see a lot of old, broken furniture, beer cans, and graffiti all over the place. Surprisingly, we found no furniture or garbage. I guess the one advantage of a house being so scary that you can't make it through without running out is that it keeps the parties out. The first room we walked into was the living room, as is most cases with a house. The room was smaller than I expected with a house so big. There was a fireplace that was in surprisingly good shape. We slowly walked through the room, stopping every couple of steps and listening for anything out of the ordinary. As we approached the kitchen area, we heard a noise in the living room. It sounded like someone starting a fire. We quickly looked back into the room to find a fire in the fireplace. We knew right then and there that this place lived up to the hype. We considered getting out of there, but we promised ourselves before we arrived that we were going to push forward no matter what happened. So we proceeded into the kitchen. The kitchen was a very big room compared to the size of the living room and compared to an average kitchen in an average house. Again, there weren't any furnishings in the kitchen either. As we walked through the kitchen, we made sure to pay close attention to what was going on in the living room. Every few steps, we would stop and look back to make sure nothing else was happening. We didn't see or hear anything other than the crackle of the fire in the fireplace. So we proceeded. As we left the kitchen and entered the hallway, we started to hear pounding on the walls coming from both sides of the hallway. We walked single file even though the hallway was wide enough for the both of us. The banging continued, and as we reached the end of the hallway, we heard a voice. It was very difficult to make out what the voice was saying. We stopped walking so we could concentrate on the voice. The voice was barely louder than a whisper. And as we listened, it would grow louder and then back down to a whisper. Finally, we were able to make out what the voice was saying. The voice was calling out to us by name. It knew our names. And it said in a woman's voice, "If you continue, you will find more than you seek. If you continue, you will find more than you seek." And as it said, the second time we heard a loud crash like a window busting, we heard the voice scream. This scream was like nothing I had ever heard before. It was so piercing that I still wake up at night hearing that scream. We covered our ears, and as I turned to look at my friend, I watched the wall of the hallway tear with claw marks like a bear or cougar had just taken his claws to the wall. We ran out of the house as fast as we possibly could, never return again. There was a house in Corinth, New York, that I investigated several times. Partially because we got more interesting stuff there than anywhere else, but mostly because the woman living there was scared for her daughter. She thought she might be possessed due to her change in behavior, sudden mood swings, depression. This family's home had been in their name for generations, and they knew of 2 people who had died in the home. They also believed that many years ago, someone had performed some type of witchcraft in the attic. I'm rambling. Let me get to the specific encounter I want to tell you a story about. My team and I were in her kitchen with her doing an EVP session. We didn't feel much of a presence and were getting ready to wrap up the session when suddenly the temperature under the table we were sitting at felt like it dropped 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I had a one-touch thermometer with me, so I quickly scanned the air above and below the table. Sure enough, there was a stark difference in temperature. This woman's mother was one of the people who had passed in the home. In fact, she had died right in the kitchen we were sitting in. So, I looked at the woman and told her I had a feeling her mother might be with us and asked if she had anything she wanted to ask her or anything she wanted to say to her. She started talking. I don't recall much of what she said, but the things I don't remember are sort of irrelevant to this anyway. What I do remember was when she suddenly paused, looked up, and said very softly, "Do you remember that squirrel we used to feed every day? Do you remember what we called him?" Long story short, I reviewed the audio about a week later. After she asked that question, I could see that there was an audio fluctuation, so I queued it up and listened with headphones on full blast to see if I could hear what was said. It sounded like Nuthead. It took me a few times listening to it to decide that was definitely what I was hearing. Well, I went back to the house a few days later to go over the evidence we captured with her. There was other stuff, but not as compelling. When we got to this audio clip, I took out a piece of paper and wrote Nuthead on it and hid it so nobody could see. I played the clip for her and asked her to tell me what she heard. After playing the clip, this woman broke down in tears. Instead of waiting for a response with regards to what she heard, I put the piece of paper down in front of her for her to read, and she started bawling even harder. Nuthead was the name her mother had coined for this squirrel. We talked to her mother that day in the kitchen. Wild. I still get goosebumps as I write about it now. This was probably 20 years ago by now, but it's something that stuck with me all that time. Anyway, I hope you too felt the chill. Have a great day. I guess I am what you might call an amateur paranormal investigator. I don't have a lot of thrilling first-hand accounts to share of this phenomenon, though it can definitely happen. I adhere to a strict protocol of cleansing, using water as a grounding agent for my body itself, as well as standard precautions for my home and vehicle, burning sage being the most common. I feel that this practice has served me well. After completing a long drive home from looking into a potentially haunted mine in Colorado, I did have one strange experience worth sharing. I got home very late, and I hadn't slept in over 24 hours. I ended up falling asleep before I could take my usual shower or do any of my other procedures. The dreams I had that night were vivid, to say the least. The part that stood out the most to me, and seems most relevant here, was when the dream seemed to take me back to the mines I'd been in for the previous few days. I'd been with a small group at all times, but in the dream I was alone at first, and the shaft I was in the dream was different than any had really been. For one thing, there was ambient light everywhere, but it didn't seem to really come from anywhere. There were no electric lights or flames or anything of that kind. This was a stark difference to having just had flashlights to work with. The shaft was also somehow larger. All the shafts we'd explored had been pretty cramped, but at the same time felt more claustrophobic than they had in reality. I was looking down the length of the shaft I was in the dream, and the weird lighting only extended so far, so there was blackness in the distance. Out of that blackness, a tall figure, just as black as the darkness, began approaching me, and it was very tall. It was shaped more or less like a man, but so tall that it was stooped over and still scraping the roof of the shaft, which had to have been at least 10 feet high, probably more. And its arms, despite its height, almost reached all the way right back down to the ground. I feel like there was more to the dream, like the figure said something at some point, but I've never been able to recall. When I woke up, I was very rattled, which is not like me, and I immediately showered and smudged my home. I even called over a friend to perform a banishing later that night, which she was surprised to hear me ask for. She knows how I operate. I was uneasy most of that following day, but that was really all that happened. It's always stuck in my mind that the dream and the visit to the mines were connected somehow. Personally, I'm glad it never went any further, and I always make sure to follow my procedures when I get done with location research now, no matter the circumstances. When I was younger and inexperienced, I decided to go to a spot in my small town that is supposed to be haunted. The story goes back to the 1960s, when a man and a woman with 2 children got into a major argument, and she decided to leave with her kids. She packed up and left with her son and daughter and began to head over a small bridge just south of town when she noticed the husband was coming after her in his vehicle. Outraged, he ran her off the bridge and killed her and the 2 children. She now wonders what used to be a river that had more water looking for her kids. So my buddy and I were investigating there, and we didn't hear anything, so we decided to go to the other side of the river. We were using EVP only at that time. The few hours we stayed there, we didn't pick up anything. We transferred the sound to a computer and plugged the computer into our television and heard a few sounds. One was at a time in the investigation when my buddy tripped over a stick poking out of the ground, and you could hear a little girl giggling. The second was when we decided to move to the other side of the river and announced to the ghosts present we were moving, and we heard the most eerie, slow-speaking voice of the little girl that said, "Please don't leave me." We were not touched or harmed anyway. But after a while we realized we did not introduce ourselves and did not ask anything present to not follow or attach itself. The night after, my mother told me she was going to take a bath and asked us if anyone had to use the restroom. My friends and I said no, and we continued to play our video game. Next thing we knew, we heard screams coming from the bathroom. My stepfather ran into the bathroom, and my mother came out wrapped in a towel, mad and upset that we went ghost hunting, and she believed something was messing with her. She went to her room and got dressed and came back out and said her back was burning. I lifted up the back of her shirt to see my initials scratched into her back, K. At this time I was a bit worried and frightened and told her to lay on the couch so I could keep an eye on her, as she said she was tired. She then woke up a few hours later but didn't quite seem fully awake, almost as if she were in a trance, sweating profusely and her hair soaked from the sweat, and she began mumbling weird things we could not understand and began saying 666, drawing a pentagram in the air with her finger. I decided to look up a prayer, hoping this would help. I ended up finding the St. Michael prayer, and my friends and I began chanting the prayer. As we were chanting, she began screaming and cussing in a disembodied voice and then suddenly dropped back down on the couch and passed back out. She woke up like nothing even happened and was confused as we explained what had happened. After time passed and nothing else happened, I decided to go to a friend's house who was a female. As I headed there, I got a text message notification that read, "Where are you going? You're not." I clicked on the notification to finish reading it, but the text message had vanished. I called my mother and asked if anyone from the house messaged me, and she said no, so ignoring it, I went over to my friend's. It was around 1 a.m., so we went to her room, laid in bed, and she got up, saying she had to go to the restroom. As I lay there, I began hearing growing noises coming from her bedroom closet. When she got back, because I wasn't going to go look, I asked, "Do you have a dog in your closet or something?" And she replied, "No, I don't own a dog. We can't have animals here." I was freaked out the rest of the night and didn't fall asleep till almost 4 a.m. listening to see if I could hear anything else. After awakening, of course I was really tired. I called my mother to make sure everything was okay, and she said nothing else happened while I was gone. And nothing has happened since. The moral of the story is don't meddle in things that you don't understand or have not studied or come prepared for. I still am interested in ghost hunting and may still do so in the future, as I am now more educated on the subject and will take better precautions in the future. I want to share my earliest experience with the paranormal. The first paranormal experience I had was back when my age was in the single digits, around 7 to 8 years old. I grew up in the Midwest Ohio, to be more specific. The town, village, as we grew up calling it, was not large by any means, around 40 to 50 people at the most. During this time, my family didn't have the internet or cable TV. Cell phones were just starting to become mainstream, mid-90s era, and as such, entertainment was mostly chores or roaming the surrounding area exploring. My house was backed by fairly dense woods. There was a steep decline with a relatively flat wooded area where a creek ran through. This creek wasn't very deep, waist deep in certain areas but mostly knee or ankle deep, but it was wide. Growing up, I lived in those woods, hiking up and down the creek, mapping the woods, and exploring a few long abandoned and collapsed houses that nature reclaimed. I lived and breathed nature, and those woods were my home away from home. My father grew up in that area. My aunt, uncle, and cousins lived just next door, and it was a pretty close-knit community. Naturally, everyone has ghost stories about their hometown, a haunted house, a tragedy of some sort that remains a stain on its history. My village was no different. My father would always tell stories about ghosts or abnormal happenings he experienced in his youth. One thing he would always tell me when I told him I was going into the woods was, "The trees may not walk about or talk, but they do see and remember." I always thought of that as him saying, "Don't be stupid out there." My first encounter with the people of the woods, which is what I always called them, was when I was on one of my daily excursions into the wild green. It was mid-July, and it was hot and humid. I stuck mostly to the creek as it was cool, and I didn't have to battle my way through thick undergrowth. I hiked approximately 2 miles along the creek, hunting for crawdads, crawfish, and looking for signs of deer, rabbits, or the fabled albino squirrel. I kept traveling and eventually arrived at a relatively open field that had waist-high grass, and I frequently stopped here to gather wild blackberries, rest, and spook the few white-tailed deer bedded in the area. But that day was different. As I drew closer to the field, I noticed someone standing there. Instinctively, I slowed down, lowered my posture, and tried to minimize my noise. I wasn't used to seeing someone out this far in the woods. The nearest house to that location was about 1.5 miles through thick undergrowth and fairly steep ravines to climb. As I hugged the bank of the creek, I moved to the edge of the open field, slowly peeking up over the tall grass to see if they were still there. Nothing. I thought that perhaps they saw or heard me trudging through the creek and instinctively ducked too. I wasn't about to find out, so I turned around and headed back home, all 2.5 miles back. I was more aware of my surroundings and far more cautious of my sound as I moved, avoiding walking in the creek to prevent the sloshing of water to give me away. As I crept through the branches jutting out into the bank of the creek, I made my way to another area I was familiar with. A small game trail ran through here, and it would cut my time and distance back home a good bit. The only downside was it was pretty overgrown to either side, and portions had thick thorn bushes. The entire time I trekked back, I felt as if I'm being watched. I never felt in danger or vulnerable of being attacked, but I could feel eyes on me. I was uneasy the entire time I followed the game trail, routinely stopping and listening to determine if I could hear footsteps or if I was being followed. Still, nothing. I made it about halfway back home when I saw in the corner of my eyes a figure standing a short distance away, but as I moved my eyes in the direction of the figure, they seemed to just meld into the foliage. I thought maybe my paranoia was making me see things, so I just continued on. A few hundred feet more, I again saw another figure, this time further away out of my peripheral, and again, as I looked in that direction, they'd meld back into the background. But this time it happened twice. As I looked and that figure disappeared, another appeared again in my peripherals, closer but still a ways away. The entire time, I never felt to be in danger. It creeped out, yes, but I never felt like whatever was there was nefarious in intent. This continued on for the remainder of my time making my way back home, but the more it happened, the less I felt afraid of the figures, even going as far as saying out loud, "I know you're there, I don't know what you want, but I'm not here to cause trouble." Eventually I made it back to my backyard, and I turned around to face the woods to see if they were there, but nothing was there. My father was next to his shed, burning some cut grass in the backyard. I walked over to him to tell him what I experienced, and before I could say a word, he looked at me and, with a slight grin, said, "I see you saw them too." I guess I had the look of terror written on my face. Without even missing a beat, he put down the hoe he was using to stoke the fire, walked past me to the woodline, and pulled out the can of dip he had in his pocket. He opened it, took a pinch out and placed it on a stone that was jutting out from the ground, and walked back. I asked what he did, and he said he gave them an offering. He began explaining what he meant by the trees see and remember, that it was important that we respect nature whenever we enter her domain and give an offering in return when we take things from her. Otherwise, she just may not let us back out. He gave me the can of dip and said what I saw were what he believed were spirits of Native Americans keeping watch over their former land. I didn't really know what they were at the time, but I followed suit with what my dad did whenever I made my way back into the woods. I always left an offering, and although I still did see them from time to time, I never felt like I was ever in danger, and I always made sure to respect them. If they appeared in my peripherals, I would travel in the opposite direction, apologizing for any transgressions. My cousins and many people in my village were all aware of their existence and just kind of gave them a wide berth whenever they appeared. I was oblivious to their existence, but when I learned of them and experienced them, a whole lot of people opened up about them, about some of the history of the town. It was an intriguing experience. I live in Massachusetts. There is a location out here called the Belchertown State School for the Feeble-Minded. Well, it has a very dark history with ill treatment of patients, including children, and reported suicides. Closed in 1992, it was mostly demolished in late 2016 into 2017, but before that I spent about a year going there on a weekly basis, usually Fridays. I began with a few friends, and then over time I would go there alone. I spent a lot of time on those grounds, to the point where I knew every part of it inside and out. I even became something of a local legend because I wore a mask when exploring, and if I ran into other groups, they would recognize me from stories. There are a few selfies out there of me with some folks too. People like taking pictures. I never saw any of the selfies, though, sadly. But there were many nights I had the whole grounds to myself. Paranormal activity was rampant, and I have some crazy stories. The most obvious and frequent one was noises. Now mind you, the whole of the complex was in disrepair. Not only that, but wild animals would sometimes move in and out of the location, so there were a lot of unidentified noises I could likely attribute to animals. I'm a firm believer in the paranormal, but I try to approach all things as a skeptic before jumping to potential activity. A few things I couldn't explain. One was the X door. There was one door in the hospital. It was on the 3rd floor, right wing, second door into the floor on the left. It was beside what once was a bathroom. This door led to a hall containing several empty rooms, and I could not determine what these rooms might have been. They didn't look like cells, more like office/storage spaces. This door was heavy. It took effort to move. I'm a pretty stocky 6-foot dude, and I had to lean into this door to get it to move. I call it the X door because it was the only door in the whole facility marked with a spray-painted orange X on the door. Imaginative name, I know. This door was a highlight for my personal trips as well as when I went with groups. We would close the door, walk away, and later come back to find it open. It's possible some animal managed to open it, as unlikely as that is. What was more unlikely were the times we left it open, and when we came back about 10 minutes later, it was closed. I tried when alone to sit and watch the door, but nothing happened. I tried to replicate potential causes, but there was zero airflow in this wing due to heavy doors on all other sides, and honestly, if an animal did get in, it could not have been bigger than a rat due to there being so little open space to move in this particular segment. I could never explain the X door, but it was always a good stun when I'd bring a group back up to that floor and we'd find the door shifted. Another experience was one time I was bringing 2 of my friends out there. It was their first time to the grounds. We made it in past the fence and to the outside of the asylum. They didn't want to go in, getting spooked. I encouraged them to try it, it had some cool stuff to see after all. And then we all 3, at the same time, heard what sounded like screaming, laughter, and talking all at the same time. I heard more laughter, but my friends say the screaming was more prominent. Now it could have been another group inside the hospital building. But here is the thing. I have been on the grounds when another group is talking, laughing, or screaming inside. You can pinpoint exactly where it goes down. Lots of broken windows and open walls, so it was pretty damn easy to lock down at least what segment the group was from. But this sound came from the building, that's the only way I can explain it. Like the whole building at once, just let loose a stream of trapped sounds. I am a gutsy bloke, but I got chills too. And we left, to the begging of my friends to flee the grounds. Wish I could have stayed that night, the activity was just getting started, I feel. I would go there weekly and spend about a half hour in several key rooms. The padded cell, the silent room, the X room, the auditorium gym. Lot of great sounds and some truly disturbing sensations. In May 2013, I went on a tour at Oak Alley Plantation in Louisiana. It was late in the day, and we were the next to last tour. At the start of the tour, our guide mentioned that the house was in its original condition except for a few replaced window panes. After we toured the upstairs, we went out some French doors onto the upper wraparound porch. I hung back as my group went around the corner so I could take a couple of pictures of the Oak Alley. When I went to catch up with my group, I was walking along the porch, and I noticed a window that had different types of glass panes. Remembering what the guide had said, I stopped to examine the glass. As I was standing there looking at the window, the sheer curtain on the inside moved. Like someone had run their hand across the curtain. I immediately went back in the house to see if I could see anything in the room that might have caused the curtain to move, but the window I had been looking at was in a closed room between the 2 open bedrooms. I heard the final tour group starting to come up the stairs, so I went back to my group. The tour was over at that point, so I asked the guide what was in that closed room. She said it was a small room that the guides used to change clothes in. I asked if there were other guides working, and she said it was only her and the guide who had been downstairs with the last tour. I asked if there was a fan in the room, and she said there was not. I asked if she could think of anything that might have caused the curtain to move, and she could not. I still don't know if I saw something paranormal or if there could be another explanation. I have this one interesting experience that I haven't been able to come up with an explanation for ever since it happened. I like to think of myself as a cynic when it comes to the paranormal. I want to believe in it, however, I am not religious and will not convince myself until I know for certain that there is no scientific explanation for the happenings, and this is the closest I think I have ever gotten. My family decided we would go on an organized ghost hunt at the neighboring town. It was late at night, and there were 3 sections to this. The first involved using Ouija board type things with a glass. Nothing happened on this one. The second involved trying to reach out to spirits in a dark room. Nothing happened in this one either. The experiences come from the third section, which was a very old courtroom, and we used technology. Firstly, there were digital thermometers set up, and one of our family members was sitting below one. These thermometers flashed when temperatures spontaneously dropped from room temperature, supposedly a sign of ghosts. All of a sudden this family member jumped up, sort of spooked, and moved seats while the organizers were explaining to us what we were going to do. He proclaimed he suddenly felt awful and tingly. Lo and behold, the thermometer was also flashing and showing very low temperatures right by where he was sitting. That was odd enough, but the second experience was just as odd. I was in a room by myself with my uncle. I had an EMF meter that lit up in the presence of an electromagnetic field. I do know these devices work, however, I don't know how legitimate the specific one I was holding was. I have my own at home, and it does react to real electrical sources, such as my PC and the plug sockets, etc. The other device I had was something called a spirit box, which was supposed to detect words ghosts were saying and read them out. This device didn't convince me at all, and I'm still not fully convinced by it, but certainly more curious about it. I was asking questions, and the EMF meter was flashing in accordance with these questions. It seemed to work, but there was no telling whether it was legitimate or not. However, I wanted to push the boundaries of yes and no questions to see how realistic it all really was. If a ghost was real, surely it can answer any binary question as long as I give it 2 options and the corresponding amount of flashes on the EMF meter for the answers, not just yes or no. So I did. I asked aloud, "Are you a man or a woman?" Flash once for man, flash twice for woman. At the time I wasn't convinced this would work as I was skeptical. However, the EMF meter flashed twice, and then within 5 seconds of that, the spirit box displayed and read out the word female. 2 completely independent devices simultaneously confirmed the answer I supposedly got. That was a big deal for me, and still is to this day. I can't figure out an explanation for that, and the 2 devices remained consistent for that entire session. I hope for the existence of something beyond life, and I hope this was my first glimpse at some actual proof for myself. This story took place in the mid-2000s in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where the Nokia 3310 was still a thing and teenage idiocy was the ruling personality. I was only 14 at the time, and while introverted, I had a group of friends who were mostly in their late teens and early 20s. While this may seem unusual, it is somewhat common for Malaysian teens to have friends with considerable age gaps, so long as you are introduced to the older members of the friend group. Well, one day this group of friends decided to visit some abandoned flats and condos from a failed development project. The reason? They wanted to try their hands at ghost hunting. Not wanting to be called a coward, I naturally took up on their little excursion. It was planned that we would visit these supposedly haunted buildings on a Thursday night, more commonly known as Malam Jumaat, since according to us Malaysians, especially to the Malay Muslims, Malam Jumaat is considered more paranormally potent compared to the other nights. Thursday night rolls around, and there we were, 20 people, including myself, arriving at an abandoned flat. Friends and mutual friends, each with their own groupies. The flat, darkened by grime and windows missing, presumably detached by junkies to be sold for small change, loomed over them. Group by small group, they entered the flat, flashlights drawn. As I recalled, it was somewhere around 10 p.m. Slowly we made our way up the floors, exploring each unit and calling out to whatever was residing there. The 20-man group had splintered into their respective groupies, their hushed conversations, callings, and the occasional bouts of snickering and laughter echoing throughout the flat. I stayed close to my group, not taking the chance of losing sight of them for even a second. For about 2 hours we explored the flat, calling out to whatever ghosts or spirits we believed were making this flat their home, but we received no reply. At this point we were tired, bored, but most importantly hungry. After a couple of calls between the heads of each group, it was decided that they would go ghost hunting and have something to fill their stomachs. So off we went, a small convoy of cars to the nearest mamak restaurant. A mamak restaurant, for you non-Malaysians, are Indian Muslim-owned restaurants that are famous for operating late into the night, or even better, open 24 hours. As we arrived and settled to our tables, again with our own little groupies, we ordered drinks and food and started shooting the breeze. The topic about the abandoned flat was initially on the table, but it was quickly dismissed since we never found anything interesting or experienced anything ghost-related from it. That is, until one of the restaurant servers marched up to one of our tables. He marched up to the table, his face stern, and pointing at the younger kid who was sitting quietly, minding his own business, he asked, "Who are you?" No reply. Again he asked, in a louder and more demanding tone, "Who in the hell are you? Huh?" At this sudden outburst of questioning, we were all stunned and had our focus on this server and that kid, who was still keeping quiet, his expression blank. The server turned to all of us and asked, "Where were you just now? Where did you drive from?" A guy from my table answered, "We drove from the abandoned flats at so-and-so." The server looked at us, and still with his eyes on us, he pointed to the kid he was questioning and asked all of us, "Does any one of you recognize this kid?" 19 pairs of eyeballs shifted towards the quiet kid, and it all hit us at once. None of us knew the kid. We made head count and totaled 20 heads, including this kid. My groupie leader asked the kid's groupie leader if he recognized that kid. "No," was his reply. "But you drove him here, right? You were with him, right?" "Yes. But I don't know this kid." At that, the server turned to the ashen-faced groupie head and told him, "Your friend is still at that flat. You go return this thing and find your friend." Only you and your group. The others cannot come, unless you want someone else switched. We shifted in our seats, and after what felt like eternity, the guys at that kid's table got up and went to their car, the kid following them without asking, without invitation. Even after food and drinks arrived for the remaining men, any appetite they had before had dissipated. The rest of the story was told to me by my friend, who heard it from the groupie head with the quiet kid. When they returned to the abandoned flats, they swept through each floor, every unit, and every room, looking for the missing kid. The thing that switched places with the kid? The entire group dare not look its way as it tailed them while they searched the flats. They felt its presence as they climbed the floors, sensing it growing more and more incensed as they neared the top floors. It took them about an hour before they found who they were looking for and passed out in a room on the upper levels. When they found him, they felt the malicious anger of their tale vanished, and when they mustered the courage to look over their shoulder, they found that it too had vanished. They didn't hesitate in getting themselves out. Not even bothering to fully awaken the passed out kid and asking about his condition, one of the bigger guys grabbed him, and they all ran, each of them praying to whatever they believe in to protect themselves from whatever resided in that abandoned flat. They got to the car, practically throwing the kid they found in the back seat. After the engine sputtered to life, the driver buried his foot into the gas pedal, and they drove away. As I recall all of this, I remembered a conversation I had with one of my Malay friends who is a little serious on matters of the occult. His stance when it comes to them: we don't disturb them, they don't disturb us. So don't go snooping in their pissing grounds. Sorry for making fun of you, man. This place is located on the north side of Athens and is an abandoned apartment building that was never completed. In an urban exploration we did a couple years ago, we saw various devil-worshipping symbols and candles all around the building. We did another one 2 months ago, and more symbols were drawn to the walls, and even more candles could be seen. Even though we could not collect any reports on people seeing or hearing anything in the building, the devil-worshipping aspect was confirmed by a next house neighbor who admitted seeing people doing rituals and the police being called multiple times. The same neighbor told us that they have even found animal bones and dead bodies in the dumpster and in front of the apartment building. As we approached the building, the atmosphere was heavy, and I can definitely say that I was scared, knowing that at any moment those people could enter the house and we would be in big trouble. We did not want to provoke anything that was in there, knowing that it was dangerous playing with demons. We were just going around the floors with our equipment, not asking questions but letting them come to us. It wasn't uneventful at all. We captured someone breathing heavily in the EVP. Trying to debunk this, no one was close to the EVP as it was left next to the EMF sitting on the edge of a window. I want to note that this happened about a month ago, and there was no wind that night whatsoever. We were moving down to the basement. Interestingly enough, there is a wooden chair, and both times that we were there, the chair was in a different position. This night, the chair was under a red painted symbol. We left the F and EVP there and let it capture anything they wanted to tell us, but nothing. As we are done, we decide to take some more pictures of the building, and one investigator sits on the chair and asks me to take a photo of him, and to be honest, I thought nothing of it. Next morning, at around 9, he calls me, telling me that he has been vomiting all night long and has some scratches on his hand. The scratches were in the bicep area, and the craziest part was that they were dead red for more than 3 days. Tell me, what do you think happened that night? I was a young, dumb kid, but was good in school, responsible, and very into the paranormal. I was close to 16 when this happened. My friend Brittany was better than me in school, more responsible, and equally into the paranormal. She was 16 when this happened. Our friendship centered around hanging out, watching TV, playing basketball, gaming, and a multitude of other things. We were always together. Another interest of ours was visiting haunted locations to try and ghost hunt. We both became passionate about this around age 8. We would gather up our EMF detectors, dowsing rods, cameras, and audio recorders. Then we would descend to the chosen location. We did this for years, probably closer to a decade before we ever saw anything. The first location we chose together as children was a cemetery about 4 miles away, located in North Glen, Colorado. We rode our bikes there in the middle of the day, and when we finally arrived, we spent our time walking around, taking photos, and gathering audio recordings. I remember getting a lot of shifty looks from people, neither Brittany nor I understood why. It was because we were 2 kids alone midday in a cemetery. People were probably creeped out, or at bare minimum pissed off by our presence, which is completely understandable, looking back on it now. Now that you have some background info, let's jump forward to when we were both 16. We were sitting in her living room. It was about 9:30 p.m., and the sun was just barely glinting over the horizon as it was setting. After several minutes of debating about what we should do, we both settled on going for a drive on Riverdale Road. This is a notoriously haunted road, and many people claim to have seen paranormal happenings. Not to mention this road has a deep history of slavery, black magic, ritualistic sacrifice, and death in general. Seriously, this is one of America's most haunted locations. My history with this road prior to the night in question only consisted of goosebumps, chills, and creepy vibes. However, I often went to Riverdale during the day to smoke weed with my other friend Joseph. We like this location because it is fairly secluded but close, and during the day it's actually a pretty drive. Some people have small farms over there, and the area is fairly spacious. The road wraps all the way around those lands, and it's a delightful little drive during the day. At night it is still secluded and close, but it is also dark, eerie, and horrifying. I had been to Riverdale countless times, both in the day and night, and I never saw anything paranormal. Cut back to driving toward Riverdale Road with my friend Brittany. It was about 10:30 p.m. when we turned onto the desolate road. As the headlights scanned across the street, we could see the darkness absorb them in the shadowy abyss. In other words, it was very dark as we began our descent onto Riverdale Road. As we inched our way along the road, we were both feeling a little uneasy, but we decided to brush it off and continue forward. As we rolled up to the first stop on Riverdale Road, out of nowhere, a light brown, wax-like, smiling face with no eyes was inches from the car. We both freaked out, but then started to realize it was just a horse pushing his nose through the middle of a fence. We both felt completely ridiculous and started to laugh about how scared we got over a horse's nose. Still feeling a bit ridiculous, we continued down the road to resume our adventure. We drove down the dimly lit roads of Riverdale for what felt like hours, and unfortunately we didn't see much at all. Feeling a little disappointed, we decided it was time to leave and drive back to North Glen. Turning the car toward one of the exits, we accelerated forward and slowed the vehicle about 50 feet before approaching a red stoplight. Without warning, a translucent grayscale ghost appears in front of us. It appeared slightly to the right of the road between the car and the stoplight. It was like looking at a person that was standing behind a thick layer of fog, but there wasn't any fog that night. You could see 85% of the ghost's body while the other 15% of the ghost was completely invisible, and as we laid our eyes upon the ghostly figure, it ran from the right side of the road toward the left side. When it reached the middle of the road, it was about 15 feet in front of us, and from this distance you could start to see some finer details. It seemed to emanate a soft white glow, but at the same time you could almost see through it as if you were looking through a dusty window. I could tell by its positioning and the way it moved that it didn't intend on stopping at the car. It seemed to have a hurried demeanor about it, as if it knew where it was going and everything in between was just an obstacle. We watched as it picked up speed toward the left side of the road, continuing off into a field where it literally faded away from existence and we couldn't see it anymore. Brittany and I sat at the light in complete shock and awe. My heart was beating in my throat, and all I could hear was Brittany repeating my name, Vince, Vince, Vince. All I could do at this point was put my head between my knees and wrap my arms around myself, kind of like what you do in fetal position. We just sat there like that for at least 30 seconds before I could even say a word. I don't even recall what exactly we said to each other after that or how we both even got home that night, but I do remember that we left pretty quickly afterward. In the end, our friendship began to drift a bit, and we both took two different paths. My path led me to Washington, and her path led her to becoming the incredible mother she is today. We've briefly chatted a few times since that night, but each time she has never spoken to me about what we saw, and each time she has refused to even address it. This encounter has stuck with me my entire life. I replay it over in my head almost every day. Because I do obsess about this encounter, I have done quite a bit of Googling on Riverdale and all of the different encounters others have experienced on the road. Many people claim to have seen ghosts, some claim to have picked up ghostly hitchhikers, and others have seen Camaro apparitions that try to run them off the road. But what I find most interesting is the notorious story about a jogger that went to Riverdale Road and was killed in a hit and run. Rumor has it that he's constantly haunting the road in search of the car that hit him that fateful night, and I can't help but wonder if the ghost we saw was that very same jogger. I hope you enjoyed the only ghostly encounter I have ever experienced in my life. It has shook me violently to my core, and I still feel the same way I did that night when I think about it all these years later. I am 27 now, but the memory still haunts me every day. I feel lucky to have seen a ghost, but this experience has made me more uneasy in the dark, and I feel like I'm constantly waiting for my next ghostly encounter. I kind of feel like I have some PTSD from the experience. I also think back to the horse and how he was so close to the fence, and how he had pushed his nose so far through the gap in the middle. It makes me wonder if he was also spooked that night. A couple friends of mine and myself decided to go to the notoriously haunted Waverly Hills Sanatorium about a year and a half ago. I am a paranormal enthusiast, and I love going ghost hunting. We didn't bring a camera or even a recorder because we just wanted to experience the sanatorium for what it really was and not as a tourist attraction. Anyway, my friends and I are walking through the sanatorium level by level. We were told a nurse died on the 4th floor, and some people say they have seen her apparition. While we were on the 1st level, we didn't really get anything, although we heard some loud banging sounds, but they were coming from above us on the 2nd level. We knew for certain we were the only ones there at the time, and we still couldn't explain the noise. We decided to stay as a group since 2 of my friends are complete scaredy cats, literally, even an amusement haunted house scares the hell out of them. Anyway, we got to the 2nd level, and as soon as we got up there, we heard the banging again at the other end of the hall. As we go to check it out, it continues, and then the banging stops abruptly. We checked some of the rooms, most of them were empty, but some had gurneys. As we reached the end of the hall, we entered a room with 2 gurneys, a chair, and a bedside table, the ones with wheels that are used to assist patients in eating. It was flipped over along with the chair, which could have been the source of the banging, but the room didn't look like anyone had entered or had even been in it to begin with. We then decided to go to the 3rd floor but had no activity, but it wasn't until we reached the 4th floor that we ended up getting some crazy activity. The first thing we heard was an audible crying sound from what possibly could have been a small girl. As we traveled the hall, we checked the rooms and saw no sign of people or ghosts. About halfway down the hallway, we heard this shrilling scream, but it wasn't a scream out of pain, it was one out of pure horror. At least that's how I can describe it because there is really no other way to describe it. The creepy thing is it didn't come from one direction, it sounded like it was coming from everywhere above, around, and below. My friend Justin and I looked at each other, we both love this stuff, so we were more intrigued than scared, but my other friend Ryan said he wanted to leave, but I assured him everything was fine and nothing was going to happen. I was wrong to say that because coincidentally, after I said that, Kevin, the 4th in the group, said he heard someone telling us to leave now. I didn't take this as true because the rest of us didn't hear anything. It wasn't until a few minutes later that we made the decision to flee. We heard a male voice, a little above a whisper, that sounded utterly terrifying. He sounded like he was threatening us, but all he said was run. He said it menacingly, as if he wanted us to run so that he or it could chase after us for enjoyment. It was at this point we noped the hell out of there. We haven't been back since. Our group went ghost hunting. I think we met a demon. We did this investigation 3 days ago, BTW, so me and my best friend have gone ghost hunting before at several different spots, but this is the first time we've done it with our whole friend group, and it is also the first time we tried the Estes method. We technically went ghost hunting twice. We went to an old buried hospital first that we've gone to once before, and we got a good bit of activity and conversations going there, but that isn't what I want to talk about. The second place we went to, and the one I'll definitely never forget, is this old mansion that's near a church. Supposedly, a stockbroker named Jack fed himself there when the Great Depression happened, and he had looted everything he had. We couldn't actually go inside because there were other people in there, so we sat down on the side of the road in a field right next to it. Investigation. I decided to do the Estes method first, so my friend was asking the questions while I was wearing the headphones. He began by explaining why we were here and that we wanted to talk. I then covered my eyes with my hood and held the headphones on tight, and we began. The words I heard were, "Hi demon house, I am asking you, Oz." Then my friend got me to take the headphones off. Apparently none of his questions were being answered, and all those were just things I had randomly said. But the creepiest thing is that right after I said demon house, they said a black cat appeared walking from the direction of the building and then just sat down and stared at us, and after they mentioned that cat and were talking about it, is when I said, I am underscoring you, all I heard was the ing. I saw it sitting down in the distance looking in our direction after I stopped the Estes. So after that and we were calming down and stuff, my friend's cousin went and did the Estes method next, so then it was me and my friend asking questions while she was answering. As soon as she sat down to do it, the cat got up and left and walked out of view. We started the questioning. I'll be honest, I wasn't paying too much attention to the conversation and was instead trying to pay attention to the area, so these probably weren't the only questions we asked. Us, who are you? Them, me them, Jack, lots of questions later that I wasn't paying attention to. My friend decided to stop, and his cousin started taking off the headphones, but the spirit box was still on so we could all hear it still. My friend began to say the goodbyes for us and tried to explain that nothing could follow us home, but the spirit box suddenly started shouting the word no over and over whenever he said they couldn't follow us back or when I said they couldn't do anything to us. My friend said, "You cannot follow us home, and you cannot hurt or do anything to us," and the spirit box replied, "You really think that?" We kept arguing with it for a minute or two, telling it over and over that it can't do anything. I should mention that, the entire time, there were cicadas making low buzzing noises in the background. The first time my friends said they have to stay and can't follow us and we're leaving, I kid you not, the cicadas' buzzing suddenly became ducking deafening, and their buzzing would keep rising in frequency whenever we repeated anything like that. At one point, I don't know when, my sister said she got poked by seemingly nothing. After a minute or two, the spirit box just stopped giving coherent responses and just kept shouting no over and over, so we just turned it off and decided to head out, the cicadas still buzzing and getting louder whenever we said something they didn't like. We got to our cars, and I'm still a little stressed and freaked out and constantly looking around, so as everyone isn't paying attention and just talking to each other, what do I see but the fricking cat again? It was following us. I pointed it out to everyone, and we all looked at it, and then we started getting in the cars. I never took my eyes off the cat, and when that cat walked to the side, I kid you not, I saw it disappear and reappear. Imagine a black cat walked behind something and appeared out the other end, that's what I saw. Except, there was nothing to walk behind. Just air. Another cat appeared, this one was brown and white, and the two cats started fighting and chasing each other all over the place until they ran off somewhere where we couldn't see them anymore. I was the last one to get in the car, but as I was getting in, my legs started cramping really badly, which almost never happens, and I had to stand outside on my own for a minute. I have a thought that maybe something was trying to make me stay there, but I dunno. We left after that and went to McDonald's. I should mention that my friend's girlfriend was praying to get the spirits or demon or whatever to stop when it started being weird at the end, and I was stressed out at the time, so I was telling it over and over to shut up about the cicadas, so that probably didn't help, but what can you do? So after that, we decided as a group to never do this again because it was kind of messed up. I'm honestly disappointed that we won't, but I understand why we shouldn't. We recorded the entire questioning on a microphone but decided to delete it after. I'll remember this ghost hunting experience for a long time, definitely the most that's ever happened whenever I've done one. Possible ghosts followed me home from ghost hunting 4 years ago. I went ghost hunting alone at Clark Road Mental Facility 4 years ago and heard screaming in the parking lot and, at the same time, in the gated area the police cars are in, which is said to be where the pool was. Occasionally I hear women's voices, and it usually says, Emily, and sometimes it happens next to my bedside when I'm fully asleep, waking me up and saying, I love you, I love you. It has happened at least a few times, and I haven't had the confidence to look that I can remember, but I woke me up completely. Early this morning or last night I woke up to use the bathroom and heard the same voice say, Emily, then I started praying and heard PSST, then stop it, then I heard it say, I love you, all within about 30 minutes. I was fully awake because after the first one I stayed up and just didn't try to sleep because it was not on my TV and I wanted it to stop first. I also heard what sounded like scribbling on a whiteboard. It wasn't on my TV and sounded close to me. I eventually fell back asleep holding my dog after an hour or two. It has never hurt me, that I know of, but what scares me is that I don't know for sure if it is just the girl who died in a fire here, and I also don't know why she would say PSST or stop it when I was starting to pray. I also heard another voice after I had already fallen asleep, or at least partly, this time right above my ear. I'm not sure if it was the same voice or if it was female. I heard it say, pushed him down on his knees, kind of, and I'm not sure exactly what it meant, but it caused me to fully wake back up a while longer. I grew up not far from Manteno State Hospital, an abandoned insane asylum in the far South Chicago suburbs. My dad would sometimes drive my family down there, and we'd circle around the property by car, just for fun. When I turned 16, he bought me my own little beater car, and of course, I had to show this awesome place to my friends. By the time I was old enough to go exploring, many of the original buildings had been renovated and repurposed as businesses. Half of the property was converted into the local VA hospital, and a quarter of it was torn down and replaced with new housing. Only a handful of the original buildings remained, all clustered in the back corner of the campus. One summer day, I took friends A, B, and C to go check it out. We brought our cameras and went with the intent to go inside and explore it. We parked in a lot where other people parked to go to work in one of the other buildings, to avoid suspicion, and walked about a quarter mile to the abandoned hall. As we walked up to this creepy old building, I felt sick to my stomach and full of dread. The main doors were chained shut, and most of the windows were boarded up. I remember walking on the porchway and choosing my steps carefully because the windows were busted out and there was glass everywhere. The four of us finally came upon a window that was accessible enough to climb into. Realizing that this was actually going to happen, I had a panic attack and couldn't go through with it. I was trembling and didn't want to be the scaredy cat, but I really couldn't do it. In fact, just in recounting this, I am still scared, and this happened about 16 years ago already. Anyway, I handed my camera to friend A and told him to take the pictures. I was petrified and felt like I would puke at any moment. Friend B and I walked back to the car in silence. I had a cigarette in the car while we waited for friends A and C to come back. My nerves calmed quickly enough. Friend B admitted that she was also scared, but she was relieved that I had spoken up so she didn't have to enter. Soon enough, our other two friends came running back to the car at full speed. We heard their footsteps pounding on the asphalt and quickly unlocked the doors. I started the car up, and we were off in an instant. I assumed that the cops had arrived, so I sped out of the campus and into town, hoping to blend into the normal traffic. I asked them what had happened and if the cops were called, and they said no. Both friends who had gone into the building said that they heard voices. Both of them said they saw a hand curl around the frame of a big metal corridor door and heard it slam shut with an impressive echo. Both of them testified that they heard someone crying, saying, "Where am I?" At some point, they got too frightened to continue and just decided to bolt. I was shocked. Friend A, who had taken my camera, was eerily quiet. Friend C showed me that he had found a newspaper from 1979 on the floor and taken it as a souvenir. I, being the more superstitious type, demanded he get rid of it. I didn't want any potentially haunted objects in my car. So he tossed it out the window without too much coercion. It took us about 45 minutes to drive home, and since we were kind of shook, we decided to go to Denny's and rehash the experience. During the ride back, friend A fell asleep. This didn't concern me much at the time but became an important factor to remember later on. We got to Denny's, and friends B and C went in ahead. I woke up friend A and asked him what happened. Why did they run? He said, "We saw someone sitting at the end of a hallway, cross-legged on the floor. It was a man, and he was crying, kind of rocking back and forth." He also explained that he thinks the entity used his energy to manifest, and that was why he was feeling so drained and fell asleep on the way back. We had a late dinner, and then I drove everyone home afterwards. After I dropped off my last friend and was going back to my house, I distinctly felt someone pressing their knees into the back of the driver's seat. It's a familiar feeling if you take the bus in high school. Lots of people prop their knees up on the seat, and the feeling is unmistakable. I yelled and sat straight up so my back wasn't touching my chair and drove home faster. The very next day, I picked up my cousin to go see a movie together. She blurted out to me that she thought she saw someone in my backseat. I was immediately horrified, as I hadn't confided in her the events from the night before. I asked her which seat, and she said, of course, behind the driver's seat. That night I had a dream about a man. He was Caucasian, mid-30s, brown hair, partially bald. He had brown eyes. He was wearing a white cotton vest, which I found odd. I instinctively knew it was the ghost my friends had seen at the hospital. In the dream, he was guiding me through a series of booby traps. He was holding me by the elbow and walking with me. He seemed sweet and harmless. I thought, maybe he's a guardian or something. These dreams continued for about a week straight. Friends who didn't know about our trip to the asylum started to have experiences in my car. One friend heard and felt someone whisper in her ear. Another had their elbow grabbed by someone in the back seat. I felt the knees in my back on many occasions. In fact, I started to anticipate it and often drove without my back touching the seat at all. One time I felt like someone was shaking my seat while I was driving. Like, hands on either side of the chair and just violently shaking it. When the experiences and the dreams didn't stop, I became scared. I didn't feel like he was a guardian anymore. Finally, after about a week and a half of this, I sat down with friend A again. I asked him, "Do you remember what he looked like?" He said, "All I could see was that he was balding and he was wearing a white vest. I don't know how, but I think his name was David." I told my parents about what happened after that. They suggested I tell David that he couldn't follow me anymore. To tell him to go to the light or whatever. At this point, I was ready to do anything because I was on edge and spooked all the time. I prayed every time I came into the house that he wouldn't follow me in. I was afraid to go out with my friends. I was afraid to go to sleep sometimes. So, 2 weeks after our initial venture into the asylum, I went back with friend A. We went during the daytime and idled in front of the building. I said out loud, "You don't belong here with me. You need to go home." Or something along those lines. I prayed a lot. I didn't want him anymore. I felt bad, but I needed him to stay there. We parked and just kind of sat there quietly for a while. I think friend A and I were just saying goodbye. Severing ties? I don't know. But it felt sad. While we were parked, I did hear doors slamming inside the building. At one point, I heard someone laughing, too. I envisioned him leaving me and my car. I told him he could never follow me again. He needed to go. To move on. We left the hospital that day and didn't go back for many years. I never dreamed of him again. I've never told anyone the full story before for two reasons, one being that it sounds totally ridiculous, and two because I am afraid that thinking about him too much will send some sort of psychic beacon out to attract him or other spirits back to me, when that's completely the opposite of what I want. So, that's it. This story takes place in Carolina, Puerto Rico, just 4 months ago. I put quotation marks around sighting because I'm not sure if it was a real sighting or just my imagination. That being said, please take everything with a grain of salt and treat this story as if it were just a satire story. After going for a walk to a local CVS with my father, I decide to part ways with him and make my way over to the beach, which is walking distance. I had a place in mind that I wanted to check out because I knew that it had been abandoned for quite some time now. Exploring abandoned places and the paranormal has been something I've always been intrigued in, ever since early childhood. I walked a couple miles east and made my way to my destination. Prior to my brilliant expedition, I had asked my stepmother, who has lived in Puerto Rico all her life, about the background of the building. She told me that it was an old condominium that went abandoned after Hurricane Maria, mind you that his condo lays right against the ocean, so it was hit harder than a lot of other buildings. The building is surrounded by barbed wire and numerous no trespassing signs put up against the walls. The main gate has been locked with a big chain and lock, making it almost impossible for someone like me to get into. Something that had caught me off guard was how cold the main entrance was compared to the weather that day. It never gets frigid in PR, and also cats were everywhere inside, reeked of cat piss and filth. I wanted to get more than anything, so I squeezed into a little opening between a wall and fence. Getting through didn't lead me straight into the building, but I just wanted to see if there were any other openings or ways to sneak on in. I look around, and to my surprise, nothing, duck and nada. I cursed under my breath out of frustration and defeat. I was definitely bummed the duck out but not torn. I decide to sit down and look at the building. It's crazy how bare it looks as if it never actually finished construction to begin with. I decide to wrap things up and that I should probably get home because it was nearing 1 a.m. I pull out my phone and take a few quick, clear pictures with a flash. That was the end of that, so I walked back to my apartment, thinking nothing of it really. Wow, an abandoned condo that I was unable to get into and failed to spot anything paranormal, load of duck and bollocks, I remember murmuring to myself during the walk home. I get back to my pad and plop into my bed and do jack shit for the rest of the night. Out of my boredom, I took a close look at the pictures I took earlier that night to notice something sticking out of the top of a wall. I zoomed in a bit to notice what seemed to be a head, not just a normal human head but the head of a rotted and deceased woman. Just above its eyes were visible. From what I made out, it had missing hair, empty eyes, and was as pale as can be. It really looked like a body that had decomposed in water. Not really scary, just unsettling. It's just weird how I didn't notice that while actually there in person since I'm usually incredibly observant. Definitely an experience. Yesterday, I went to the infamous Rolling Hills Asylum, one of the most haunted locations in the world, for a 3-hour tour and ghost hunt. I went with my mom because she is interested in ghosts too. We didn't have any equipment besides our phones and a recording device on my mom's phone. Besides, it was during the daytime too, and we only had about an hour and a half to investigate. After our tour, we walked around and went into the shadow person hallway, aka the female ward, up on the second floor. When we got into the first room located on the left, there were some toys scattered in one part of the room for children's spirits. As soon as we walked in, a volleyball on the floor slowly rolled towards us, then stopped. It had moved roughly a foot or two across the floor. I put it back in its original spot, and it did not appear there were any drafts in that room. I kicked the ball around, asking for a spirit to come play with me, but the ball didn't move. I was disappointed because only seconds before I walked into the room, I had turned off my phone and had just turned it back on as we stepped into the room but was not fast enough to get the camera to record. My mom had her recorder on her phone rolling as I attempted to make contact with any spirits in that room, and I thought I heard a whistling noise upon playback. Next, we headed out into the hallway, and I sat on a wheelchair that is supposed to move by itself. It didn't move to me, but we still had more time to investigate. We headed over to the infirmary part of the building and went into the room where, on Ghost Adventures, it was the door that slammed. I took a look around but didn't have any experiences there. We didn't have anything really happen in the infirmary, but it was a cool place. We headed up to the organ room, where George Fleming is said to have died, and on the episode of Ghost Adventures, it is where they said they found blood on the walls and candles and such, and where Nick captured the disembodied scream. I sat roughly where he sat, but no ghostly activity occurred. However, there was an eerie feeling about the room that I didn't feel in any other room. It was odd, but since we weren't getting activity, we decided to leave and went downstairs, all the way down to the morgue. In the morgue, there was an autopsy table. I think it was where people claimed that there was a heaviness on their chest when they laid down on it. I laid on the table and didn't feel anything. There was a suit hanging on a string nearby that, if you asked questions about people in the room, the suit would turn in that person's direction. When a few other people entered the morgue, they asked if the suit would turn to my mom and me. It was still, and nobody had moved it, then it slowly turned toward my mom and me and stopped. When I was lying on the table, it hadn't moved at all. But now it was turning toward us. Pretty creepy, but I wanted to see some more parts of the building and kept moving. We went to the area where, on Ghost Hunters, a door supposedly moved towards Jason. I'm not too big of a fan of Ghost Hunters, but this was pretty early on in the show, which is always more credible, but paranormal TV shows are always a subject of debate if they are real or not. We had found that door accidentally looking for the basement tunnels where the spirit of Raymond is said to be. My mom took one look in the room, and she said she didn't like it, she felt there were spirits in there. My mom is not a psychic at all, but she says she can almost feel the presence of a ghost when she has a heaviness in her chest, not like the morgue table where people felt pressure on their chests. This was she had a heavy feeling. I looked around inside, but I couldn't really feel anything. We went back to the shadow person hallway once more, and as I made my way there, I looked up at the end of the hallway, and it looked like a shadowy woman with curly hair and a bun at the back of her head went into one room. I hurried down the corridor, and it looked like the woman had gone into a room where the doors were closed. In the next room over, there were 3 women trying to communicate with the spirits, but none of them looked like what I had seen. Especially since the woman I saw moving across the hallway was completely black. There was another room, I believe, known as the Vortex Room, and my mom felt sick in there, but the moment she left, she felt okay again. It was nearing the end of the investigation, so we had to wrap it up. I sat in the wheelchair once more and listened because I thought I had heard a creepy squeaking noise next to me. My mom began to leave to go where everyone was supposed to meet up at the end, and I heard the squeaking begin to follow her down the hallway, so I rushed over and told her. I do think the Rolling Hills Asylum is haunted. Has anybody been there or experienced anything similar? I would like to know. This happened in January of 2018, when I was in 6th grade and 11 years old. I was a pretty average kid, I got A's and B's, and I had a few friends, one of whom was my best friend, we'll call him Colin. Colin lived about half an hour away from me, so I didn't go to his house that often. When I did go to his house, we would always play in his woods. He had a good 3 acres of just forest and trees and creeks. There was also a good-sized pond that we would go fishing in during the summer months. However, there was an abandoned house by the end of the property. It was a normal house, 2 floors. It had been abandoned in the 1960s, according to Colin. Since the 1970s, teenagers had been partying in it and had trashed it. Colin's eldest sister, Anna, who was 26 at the time of writing, used to party in it as well, but she stopped sometime before Colin was born for reasons she would not say. The one time we told her we were going, she freaked out. She told us that we should stay away from that place at all costs and never go inside, especially not in the basement. We just thought she was talking about drugs or alcohol, but we were wrong. So wrong. I had taken the bus over to Colin's house on Friday, and I stayed the night, with plans to explore the abandoned house the next morning. When we woke up, we put our orange vests and paintball masks on so that we would be easy to find. We took a gator, that kind of pickup truck ATV you see at farms, to the end of the trail, which I noticed eventually began to get paved. Hey, Colin? I asked. Yeah? Did you ever pave this trail? Nah man. Huh. Stop the gator, I yelled. Colin slammed on the brakes and asked what the hell was wrong. I was staring off into one part of the snow-covered forest. I saw a set of stairs. Like stairs from your house. Just taken from a random house and then dropped in the woods. I thought they were really cool, but Colin made it very clear that we should just keep going. He might have just been tired, but I think that there's another reason. I've researched the stairs, and some things have come up, but if you know anything, please let me know. We kept going, and I started to notice how the further we went on this trail, the more dead the trees were. Even though it was winter and snowing out, the trees were visibly dead. I pointed this out to Colin, but he again just shrugged it off. We got to the house, and you can see the view from the gator in the photo below. The trees cleared to the small yard. We got off the gator, and Colin grabbed his rifle from the bed of the gator. We went to the door, and Colin shot off the knob. Ladies first, ha, 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 he said. It was nice of him to try to lighten the mood, but I was starting to regret coming here. We heard a loud crash in the basement. Both of us literally started pissing ourselves. "What the hell was that?" I said. I felt like I was going to throw up. We went inside, and Colin aimed his gun around. We went upstairs first. We didn't find much, as everything was trashed from the parties that used to go on here. Something I forgot to mention was that the parties suddenly stopped one night in 2002, for an unknown reason. There were so many mysteries in this house, and I was so glad to finally be here. But I was also trying to figure out what possibly could have made that noise. We finished up the stairs and went to the main floor. Once again, we found nothing. But as we made our way to the back door, we found bits of a deer. Legs and guts. We found a trail of blood and followed it to the basement door. It led to darkness. "Maybe we shouldn't go down," I said, but was cut off by Colin with, "TJ, shut the hell up right now." Colin's eyes were wider than I knew possible. I thought the skin would tear at his temples. Colin pointed towards the basement, and I saw it, 2 yellow eyes the size of grapefruits. "AHH. I screamed. I mimicked my scream in a distortion that scared the absolute hell out of me. It came closer, and the light of my phone flashlight illuminated its face. It was not human. Its eyes took up most of its face. It smiled this horrible smile, revealing yellow teeth. It slowly cocked its head, to the point where it had passed 180 degrees. "Colin, shoot it," I said. The thing imitated it once again in that distorted voice. "Let's just get out of here," Colin told me. We dashed to the door, which was closed and locked. I fiddled with the lock until the creature took what Colin would later call an impossibly long step towards us, and it leaned over me. I didn't notice until I felt a drop of drool drip on my neck. My heart sank. "TJ. Move." Colin blew the lock off with the gun again. The knob had been put back on. We ran to the gator, and Colin floored it. We almost crashed when we heard a loud, inhuman shriek come from the house. We got back to Colin's. We called the police, and since I knew they wouldn't come if we said there was a monster in that house, we said that there was a dangerous person in that house. Colin's parents were not home, and his siblings were off doing things, so it was just me and him. The cops came after what seemed like hours of looking out the window to see if it was there. We told them that it was in the abandoned house in the basement. After about 45 minutes to an hour, the officers came back, radioing for a coroner and a forensics unit. The cops asked us a few questions, and they told us what they found in the basement. The thing had long gone, but they found bones and remains, some human. They found bodies that were later, after DNA testing, found to belong to missing persons from months and even years ago. The most sad part was when they told us about the remains of small bones that they thought to be animal bones, but after more DNA testing, were found to be human and belonging to someone who was less than a year old. The story isn't over yet. What made me want to write this story was something that happened to me a few weeks ago. Colin texts me at about 7 p.m., sounding panicked. I ask him what is wrong. He sends me the following, copied and pasted from the actual text. "Anna told me what happened in that house. In '98, she was at a party at the house, and everyone was drunk except for her. A guy gets taken into the basement, and he doesn't come out. His parents file a missing persons, and no one knows where he is until New Year's Eve 1999, when Anna arrives at the New Year's party to find cops examining the body of the guy all bloody and screwed up. Anna stopped going to the parties from then on. She got so mad at me, bro. This creeped the hell out of me, and I still can't sleep some nights. I am now 12 years old at the time of writing, going into 7th grade. I still think about what happened if we went to the basement. What if we would have been one of the bodies in the basement? I hope no one ever has to feel that kind of fear that me and Colin did. I know that it's still out there. I'm going to a Boy Scout camp next week, and I think this will be a good story to tell at the campfire, but I hope it doesn't come true at the camp. So I went ghost hunting with my fiancé, his mom, and his sister to this mansion that's now a museum, as it once belonged to a wealthy family. 25 people, including us, were quite big, so we did our meditation, had a 15-minute gathering trying to welcome the spirits, and then split into small groups in the big mansion. We went upstairs and did a séance. While we were all holding hands in a circle, one of the ghost hunter advisors asked the ghost to touch one of us. I was expecting that one of the ghosts would touch my fiancé because he seems spiritual more than me. While we were holding hands in a circle, a few people in the room started feeling dizzy. I was as well until I felt pushed and something grabbed from my shoulders. I broke the circle after feeling startled. I began to feel dizzy. One of the ghost hunters had to take me out to ask if it was alright if I could continue because it seemed like the spirit was attached to me, and I willingly said yes, hoping it wouldn't just be me affected by it. So I went back upstairs while my fiancé and the others were investigating the room. I felt like I had to go to the other room with the rest as they were picking up some activities in their room, then it stopped. While I was in a different room with 4 other people, the temperature shifted and turned cold right near me, so I asked a man to check with their device on the temperature. And I felt my energy draining and disassociating more than my first encounter, and it was only me who was affected. Apparently the ghost's name was Richard, and he was very keen on me. The others haven't felt anything from him. He was using most of my energy, and any time the others stood near me, they would say he didn't like others to be next to me. Not even the others who were trying to be next to me to feel the small, cold air, so they had to pull me out of the room because I wasn't myself and Daisy. And as soon as they pulled me out of the room, Richard did not like that, he was upset. But part of myself wanted me to stay still, it felt like it wasn't my choice. After the same ghost hunters taking me out of the room, they had to help me get back to my senses, and then when I returned, I felt like he wanted to attach with me again, but I had to fight my way through to not allow him. When I went back upstairs, I went to find my fiancé and decided to hold on to him, and it seemed like Richard did not like that. I felt him trying to mess with my emotions as soon as we left upstairs, heading to the break room downstairs for some tea. Because I was feeling all weird and not myself, I had to get outside and calm myself down. After a short while of exploring the rest of the mansion, it seemed like Richard hadn't tried to spook or use my energy since we were going in different rooms. Until one of the ghost hunters decided we go back to the same area upstairs to see if Richard was still there. He was still there, but he was really upset. He was making others feel nauseous and dizzy and drained one of the devices. One of the ghost hunters felt like she needed to pull us away from upstairs because she felt like he wasn't happy. I felt like he wasn't happy with me not allowing him to take control of me. Today I haven't stopped wondering, even though I know we did our last meditation to make sure no spirit would follow us home. I still feel weird. I don't even know why I'm thinking about Richard and why I still have his photo on my phone. I even couldn't sleep a wink as I had a dream about myself coming back to the same room where my second encounter happened. Does it mean the spirit is attached to me? To start off, I just want to say that I am in no way a skeptic. Like most of you, I absolutely relish in the paranormal and unexplained. I am, however, extremely wary of fabricated stories. I feel whenever I tell of my experiences, they are quickly dismissed as being made up. To start things off, my mother is a ghost fanatic and wanted to spend Thanksgiving on the Queen Mary with her friend and myself included. She watches all those Travel Channel shows and decides she wants to explore the boiler room and the swimming pool of the ship. The first room we had received was on the A deck and right next door to a family of screaming children, so we were promptly moved to a far bigger room on the B deck, right near the ice machines and stairways. The hallways were long and tight, an absolute enigma. But I was too in love with the boat to care. It was probably the closest I was going to ever get to staying aboard the Titanic. Our maid stopped us outside of our room and told us how we got one of the worst rooms on the floor. We all laughed and passed it off as her trying to add to the experience. After exploring the ship for several hours, we decided to get dressed and head out for dinner. My mother and her friend spent a long time trying to get the porthole window opened, but gave up after I convinced them that they were probably sealed to keep kids from falling out of them and into the ocean. We left the room, me leaving last, but quickly turned back around when my mom's friend forgot her purse. My mom opened the door and made a distressed gasp, you know, the startling kind one hears right before getting into a car accident. The porthole was opened wide and the curtains had been drawn back. Turns out the windows can be opened if you turn a knob and push it down to its side as hard as you can. My mother was close to tears due to being overwhelmed, and I was creeped out because my bed was right beside it. Upon investigating, I noted the window was too heavy for the wind to push, if there had been any, and there was no way a maid could have done it, for we had only walked 2 doors down before turning around. My mom's conclusion: ghosts. We talked about it all the way down to the dinner at the bar for food, which was light and pricey but pretty bomb. After that, we happened upon the tour center, and there they had 2 ghost tours, one that was cheap and during the day, and one that was expensive and during the night with a paranormal investigator for a ghost hunt. My mom offered the latter for an early Christmas present, and I was stoked but almost certain I wouldn't get any evidence. Was told to meet up at 10, so we went around to find the swimming pool, which, to my mom's displeasure, was closed to the public, and the boiler room, which we found, and my mom made me take a picture in the doorway where a man had died like I was smiling in front of the Grand Canyon. Morbid, right? We went back to the room, ate dinner, and waited for 10 p.m. to roll around. When it finally did, my mother and her friend were sleeping, with the porthole opened, mind you, for they thought it was a sign of some sort, and I put on a heavy wool trench coat and strutted alone the empty hallways, think The Shining, to join the group. 3 random couples, a boy my age and his mother, 2 foreign men, and myself. The guide arrived, and we headed down to the theater, which doubled as the entrance to the boiler room. In this room there was a large-scale map of the boat, and we all grouped around so he could show us where we would be hunting. Being as shy as I was, I stood in the center with a girl 4 feet to my left and a foreign man 3 feet to my right. As the guide was talking, I felt the man to my right promptly grab my butt and squeeze, hard enough to feel fingers. In shock, I turned to him and saw that he had taken no notice of me and continued to stare ahead at the guide. I was insulted and perplexed, for my coat was long and heavy, and the man, who stood a great distance away, would have had to bend down and actually lift my cot to get to my butt. I didn't say anything out of fear of embarrassing us both, especially if it was just a weird spasm in my muscle and the guy was innocent. We headed downstairs, where the guide introduced tools we could use on our investigation. I wanted something cool like an ovilus or one of those electrowave thingies, but got a pair of dowsing rods, which I found later are actually my favorite things ever. He told us of the experiences they've received in that area and about the spirits that frequented that area. One ghost in particular was a boy of 18 named John Petter, who had been crushed to death in the watertight door during his rounds and tends to grope at ladies by pulling their hair or groping them inappropriately. I recalled my earlier incident, but due to my anxiety, I could not bring myself to announce what had happened. He let us go loose and investigate by ourselves, and since the hot spot for everyone had been by the watertight door 13 and I didn't want to talk to myself in front of strangers, I walked around the corner and began my investigation in the dark hallway. I held the rods in front of me like I was shown and began to ask questions, very politely, mind you. I referred to him as Mr. Petter and used my please and thank yous. Are you here with me, Mr. Petter? Please cross the rods for yes. To my immediate surprise, the rods twitched before crossing into an X. I asked every question several times, just so that I was sure it was just me messing up in any way. Every time the rods would twitch as if they were thinking, then I would receive a yes. I would then thank him and ask him to please put the rods back to their starting position, sometimes having to ask twice, for they would twitch in the center and not move. You died on July 10, 1966? Yes. Is there anyone with you? The rods stood still for no. You are 18? Yes. Was it you who had touched me in the theater earlier? Yes. Do you like me or something? Yes. Do I annoy you? Yes. Now, I fancy the idea of a ghost boyfriend, so I asked questions like this till the guide showed up to see how my progress was going. I let him watch me talk to Mr. Petter and told him about being grabbed earlier. He was more excited about me being touched than the dowsing rod action unfolding before him. He told me to carry on, and we would all meet up in 10 minutes. I joined the boy and his mother, who were very shocked about my contact. I actually thought that leaving the area would cease the communication I had, but he seemed to follow me everywhere I went. I began to ask him to use the rods to show me where the guide was. The rods moved right, pointing at where he stood talking to another guest down the hall. Then I asked them to point to the mother, and they moved far left. Then the boy. Straight ahead. Everyone was amazed, and I kind of felt like a superstar. I asked if Mr. Petter would stay with me for the length of the tour, and the rods crossed in a yes. We all met up for an EVP session. A couple left the group due to feeling sick, and both foreigners left because they didn't really understand the gist of the tour. The guide told everyone about my experience and told me that he thought it was weird that John had picked me, for my hair was dyed red, and they have caught several EVs of him announcing that he preferred brunettes over any color. He showed us all the EVPs they caught in here, including 3 where Mr. Petter could be heard citing his love for brunettes. We did this session for a while but never got anything beyond the clanging of the boat settling. We moved further down on the boat where there had been a more malevolent spirit, also named John. Here we had to take a large industrial elevator down, and there was barely any light to be seen aside from those laser point star shower things that investigators use to sense movement. The mother had her hair pulled here, and immediately I felt unsure about the area. I stepped away to use the rods by myself, and suddenly I heard something running underneath the grates I stood on. This caused me to scream like a little girl, to which the guide ran over like a lifeguard in action. He grabbed his camera and light, and after searching the area, he deduced that it was probably just a rat. I used the rods after he left. Are you here, Mr. Petter? Yes. Was that you who scared me? No. A rat? Yes. Did you think it was funny that I got scared? Yes. Is that other John here too? Yes. Will you keep him away from me? He's aggressive. Yes. I met up with the security guard that travels around with the guide. He seemed more impressed with my session than anyone else. Suddenly something crossed the lasers and freaked us both out. Was that you, Mr. Petter? No. The other John? Yes. Will you cross in front of those green lights? No. Why? Do they hurt you? Yes. The guard was ecstatic and told me to ask if Jackie was with Mr. Petter. Yes, the rods responded, and the guard got nervous and called the guide over, telling him that Jackie was there. The guide scoffed a bit and said, "I don't think so. Ask again." I did, and the rods crossed again. "Nah, I don't think Jackie is here." And he walked away without even explaining who Jackie was. I stepped off to the side and explained to Mr. Petter that we were going to the pool soon, and I had hoped he would talk to me there as well. He agreed, and then I asked if we were what he had considered friends. The rods twitched a long while before finally crossing for me. "Did you open our window in our room?" "Yes." And that was the last thing he said. We went to the pool and turned in our equipment, and my stomach dropped when I realized I couldn't talk to them anymore. I was upset because I was having too much fun and didn't want to stop. The guide told us of an apparition they called Jackie, who was a little girl rumored to have drowned there. He showed up her EVPs, and we all went into the women's changing room, where a ghost cat had also been rumored to roam. We sang Itsy Bitsy Spider and Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but Jackie never showed. The cat, however, did. It could be seen running from stall to stall in the changing room, and the mother from earlier mentioned how she could almost see it in her head, gray, maybe calico with black and stripes. At the end of the session, the guide said, "Bye-bye, kitty, can you meow for us?" Everyone held their breath till all we could hear was the blood in our ears, and from the bottom of the hall came a high-pitched meow, and everyone flipped out. Brava cat. We all caught the moment on our phones, but when I checked on it later on, the audio drops exactly where the cat meows and continues after. Needless to say, I was very upset. The tour ended, and I tried to rush back to my room, all the while feeling uneasy. I went to sleep with the porthole opened, and for the first time since I was a child, I covered my head in an attempt to hide away from whoever was watching me. Before leaving the next day, I looked out and below and discovered our room was above the entrance to the boiler room exhibit. For a week after, I experienced strange things at home. Things like clothes being thrown off my bed or the sound of barefoot thumping through my bathtub, across my bathroom floor, then out and into my bedroom. My sister would see someone standing in the corner of my room when I Skyped her, like a shadow, and would send me the pictures of it. I was almost certain my ghost boyfriend would visit and order dowsing rods off Amazon, but they arrived too late, and I didn't get to talk to him again after that. But I hope to go again and rekindle the friendship this year, now that I have my rods. When I left home for college, I ended up finding a paranormal team in the same town that I went to school in. I went on about 7 investigations before anything crazy really happened. What I remember is we ended up at a theater about an hour south of the college town. I had brought my sister along, and half of the team, 10 total, went along. Everything went fine, and there wasn't too much activity aside from shadows and one EVP. I ended up watching a friend's house that weekend as well, so once the investigation was done, my sister and I drove back, and she went to her house, leaving me alone. I walked into my friend's house and noticed that the back door was wide open. Mind you, this door was one I couldn't get open for the life of me the morning prior. I pulled and pulled until giving up and letting the dog out the front door. 1 dog, 3 cats. My first reaction wasn't fear for something paranormal, but fearing the fact that the cats could have run off. I ran up the stairs, and about midway I felt my back start to burn. Again, I didn't pay attention because I was too worried about the cats. I found all the animals and calmed down a bit. My back was still hurting, so I ended up touching it and saw blood on my fingers. Looking in the bathroom mirror, I saw 3 distinct scratches in a row. I had not held the cats or scratched my back in that one period, so there was no way those marks should have been there. I do believe something followed me back, but I ended up telling whatever it was that it wasn't welcome and needed to leave. Nothing happened after that. I have a few other things that happened in my short time of being on a paranormal team, but that was the only thing physical that happened. This took place about 6 months ago at my parents' house, where I lived before I moved in with my grandma. We had lived in that house pretty much my whole life, and there was this one house up the dirt road that never sat right with our family. It was always being sold and bought by different people but never moved into. I don't know the exact history of this house, but what my dad told me was that the family living there apparently disappeared and left all furniture and only took small personal items. He said that the police had been able to track them up to the border of California, where they kind of just disappeared from the planet. No reports of them anywhere existed after that. Anyway, the house was petty creepy. The front porch was covered in sticks and dead leaves, surrounded by overgrown weeds and bushes, with a small tree coming through the porch from underneath. The driveway had a little shed-type thing over it on the side of the house, but it had no walls, just a ceiling to block the rain from making the ground muddy or getting the car wet. There was a small shed farther away from the house, and then a gate leading to a pasture with cattle areas, a horse arena, 2 locked shipping containers, and 2 very large shed-like buildings separated from the outside only by the back wall and side walls. There were 2 garages with little ditches going into the ground all the way down both sides of the inside of them. The inside of the house had multiple different cutouts in every room. They each had a piece of drywall that fit perfectly to cover up the holes. Some of the holes lead into the walls of the house, one went under a bathtub, and another one led into what seemed like a closet. We couldn't fit in the holes, though. We showed up, and both the front and back doors were locked, so we found a window to climb through. We climb into the window and enter a dining area type room with a bar, and then the living room connected to the dining room. Moving into the living room, we continue down a hall. There were 2 rooms and a bathroom. The bathroom had a medicine cabinet and a broken toilet. One of the bedrooms had a single book. The living room had a single chair. We went back into the living room, past the kitchen and pantry, and entered the master bedroom, which had its own bathroom. The room immediately gave all of us a bad vibe. The room was empty other than a broken light bulb cover on the ground. The windows had blinds over them. One window looked as though someone had slid down the blinds onto the ground. The bathroom was nasty, with a yellow tint all over everything. The shower had little specks of brown looking spots everywhere. Welfare the room and enter the living room and start setting up. I had downloaded some apps to try and catch something on camera or voice recording. I didn't think any of it would work, but my mind would change about that. I opened an app that displayed an EMF reader, and apparently it recorded what ghosts said and displayed it on screen in a little box. The little box said, "Raid," and then, "Next to you." My brother looks down, and there is a can of Raid on the ground next to him. Each of us swears it wasn't there before. Next I open an app that just claimed to record ghosts' voices. I hit record, and we just sit and wait. Then we hear a loud bang coming down the hall. It sounded like a door, but no door had shut, so I'm guessing it was that medicine cabinet that was closed when we looked in the beforehand. I had it recorded. We bolted out the window but didn't leave the property. We entered the small shed on the side of the house. It had a bag of dog food and some random tools. I set my phone up on a metal bar going across the wall and left it to record us. A few minutes later, I pick up my phone and look at it. The entire screen was glitching out, with lines and streaks going across the screen and different pixels glitching in and out. It was just a mess of different colored lines and squares. I couldn't get the phone to work at all after that and threw it away along with the evidence. While we had been in the house, we had also heard footsteps coming from outside, and all of us kept seeing a light in the windows. Let me know what you guys think happened there. I got into urbex at an early age, middle school, to be exact. This was long before it became popular in the internet. I was never outgoing, academically advanced, or particularly good at sports. Neither me nor any of my friends had much extra money to throw towards spending afternoons at the mall or arcade. My first experience with urbex started when some friends and I had a sleepover at Caitlin's. Caitlin lived in a trailer in a rural village. A lot of the houses nearby were large and expensive, not quite mansions but pretty close. We were eating popcorn and watching a movie when Caitlin mentioned an abandoned home behind her house. She explained that the couple who lived there had a nasty divorce, and the house was up for sale as a result. Caitlin had never seen the inside of the house, but her mom had mentioned it being really nice. I had an idea to liven up our night. "Why don't we go see it?" I asked. They all looked at me like I was crazy. "We've snuck out before. Why not just go over, take a look, then come right back?" Caitlin shrugged. "I don't see why not," she said. Caitlin distracted the family dog with a treat while the rest of us crept out the back door. It took less than 5 minutes to reach the house. We tried unsuccessfully to pick the lock, but luckily Jessie found an unlocked window. The interior of the house was magnificent. The floors were all marble, and there was an extravagant fireplace in the living room. We began to look around. Each room seemed more luxurious than the last. One of the more notable spaces was a hot tub, oddly placed at the landing of the stairs in the front room. After an hour or so of exploring, we headed back to Caitlin's. Luckily, we got back in without waking her parents. Since that night, urbex has been my passion. Caitlin and I explored many abandoned places together. Our selection of locations to explore expanded over the years as our curfew got later and we got our licenses. Although Caitlin was adventurous, there was still one destination she avoided. Oak River School was one of the most insidious yet least known scandals in my hometown. It seemed to be a typical high school. It boasted average academic scores and a great football team. But below the surface, something wasn't right. A record number of graduates from Oak River were diagnosed with cancer, particularly leukemia. Some were diagnosed only a few years after graduation, and others not until decades later. The school was abruptly closed, and students were sent to temporary sites to continue classes while a new school was quickly rebuilt, several miles away from the old one. Eventually the truth came out. The soil Oak River High was built on was used as a dumping ground for nuclear waste in the 1940s. The cancer rates weren't a coincidence. The old Oak River was never torn down. My aunt, Cora, was one of the many unfortunate alumni who developed leukemia. She passed away when I was 17. She was the stereotypical cool aunt who let me watch R-rated movies and served me Pepsi in a wine glass whenever I visited. More than that, Cora was the only one in my family I could truly be myself around. From holding me as I cried when I wrecked my bike at 6 years old to helping me through my first breakup at 15, I could always count on her. Losing Cora was the worst experience of my life. I'd always wanted to explore Oak River, but for some reason her death made me fixate on it even more. I had to see what it looked like, the radioactive school frozen in time. I felt like if I walked through the same hallways or stepped into the classroom where Cora had been so many years before, she would be there with me. Of course I was smart enough to realize this was just a morbid fascination from grief and that nothing would change once I left. But I still couldn't let go of the thought of going to Oak River. "Come on," Jess agreed to go, and she's bringing all her photography equipment, I begged Caitlin during our phone call. "No," she responded. "You know that's the one place I won't go." I accepted her answer and called Jess to let her know we would be going without Caitlin. We met at the back entrance of Oak River at 8 that night. The school wasn't as difficult to break into as I expected, and we quickly found ourselves in the hallway. Some old trophies and medals were still on display behind the dusty glass. Why didn't they take those? I wondered out loud. They're probably all covered in radioactive dust, Jess laughed. Ron, Jess's boyfriend, met us shortly after we found our way in. He's into paranormal investigation and wanted to try out some of his equipment as the school was rumored to be haunted. They proceeded to the gym and were messing with the EMF sensor for a while, so I decided to look around on my own. The first few classrooms I looked at weren't as bare as I expected. They still had posters on the wall and other equipment out. I found a globe and spun it, instantly regretting my decision as dust flew into the air. Luckily, we had worn masks and gloves to try to limit our exposure as much as possible. I heard a rustling noise. I turned around to see where it was coming from. Next to the boarded-up window, I noticed a mostly wilted potted plant. But the plant wasn't dead. It was moving. Very subtle movements. I had to do a double take to be sure of what I saw. "What the hell?" I whispered. The only way I can describe the movement is almost a sort of twitching. I got out my phone to record and picked up a ruler to poke it. The plant coiled around the ruler tightly, almost yanking out of my hand. I yelled and jumped back. Jess and Ron came running. I tried to explain what happened, but they didn't seem convinced. Ron found a pointer by the chalkboard and poked the plant again. It didn't move. I stammered, trying to explain what happened. Jessica and Ron exchanged glances. "Maybe you shouldn't be walking around here alone," suggested Jess. Ron nodded. "Let's all just stay together," he suggested. I reluctantly agreed. We took a look in a few other classrooms. Jess photographed each as we went along. Eventually we made our way into the cafeteria. We found some old trays, glasses, and even unopened cans of food. As we ventured further into the kitchen, Ron halted, almost causing Jess to run into him. "Why'd you do that?" she snapped. "Shh, listen," whispered Ron. Through the silence, I could hear a faint chewing noise. It continued for a few minutes, then came the clang of a can hitting the ground. A light rustling followed. We stood there, frozen. Ron involuntarily coughed. A figure emerged from the darkness. Jess turned the flashlight to it. It definitely wasn't an animal, but it also couldn't be human. It stood on two legs, was almost 7 feet tall, and was emaciated, with yellow-tinged skin speckled with red boils that looked like they were about to pop. The figure let out a groan that sounded equal parts terrified and angry. Jess screamed, dropping her flashlight. Ron and Jess took off in one direction while I ran in another. I dove into a janitor's closet. I tried to quiet my breathing as much as possible, even taking off my mask, trying to catch my breath. I sat against the wall, head in my hands, trying to stave off a panic attack. I looked around the closet a bit, seeing if there was anything I could use for self-defense. All I found was an old broom. I stayed quiet for a while, then hesitantly stepped out of the closet when I was convinced the creature was nowhere close. I began looking for Jess and Ron. I tried calling Jess, but my phone had no service. I heard labored breathing and trudging down the hallway. Damn it, I thought. I noticed a door on my left. It was glass but was fogged up to the point where I couldn't see through it. The hallway was a dead end, and I could hear the figure getting closer. I opened the glass door and stepped into the room, The air was thick and humid. I struggled to keep from coughing. I put the broom through the door handles to barricade myself in. I hoped the figure would pass me by, but then I heard a pounding at the door. I wasn't sure how much force it would take to break the old glass, and I had no interest in finding out. I panted the room with my flashlight, looking for another way out. My flashlight passed over a dark, reflective abyss. This was the old pool. The walls were covered in a mixture of black and green molds. I remembered Cora had mentioned being on the swim team years before. There was a door on the other side of the room. I began making my way to the other side, but quickly realized my way was blocked by some overturned bleachers. I tried lifting them up, but it was no use. "Harper," Jesse yelled from the door on the other side of the room. Noticing the predicament I was in, Jesse and Ron attempted to move the bleachers but weren't able to either. At this point, the glass door was splintering from the humanoid monster pounding on it. "You know how to swim?" asked Ron. I nodded. "Are you crazy?" screamed Jesse. "She can't swim through that radioactive bullshit." I'd already accepted my fate of having to wade through this disgusting abandoned pool and tried to reassure her I'd be fine. I found a piece of wood to set my backpack on, trying to keep it as dry as possible. I stepped into the cold, dark water. The water felt thicker than I expected. It was like moving through jello. The smell was a repulsive combination of decay and metallic. I swam as fast as possible. I'd almost reached the edge when the water began rippling. My right leg stopped moving. It was caught on something. Jesse and Ron noticed my struggle. Ron jumped into the water and tried to pull me forward. He shined a flashlight through the dark waters, revealing a labyrinth of dark green limbs. "What the hell?" Ron whispered. The water began to move rapidly. I felt the slimy substance tighten around my leg and screamed. Ron began thrashing around, cursing and yelling. I frantically grabbed for my backpack, retrieving my pocket knife out of the front pocket. I took a deep breath, went underwater, and hacked at the slimy substance trapping my leg. It began to twitch as the grip loosened and I got myself free. Jesse was pulling Ron out of the water on the other side, crying frantically. Something most people don't know about Jessie is that she had an extreme fear of water and couldn't swim. A near-drowning experience when she was 4 had left her traumatized. I pulled myself up to the surface, and we all ran out the door. Ron was limping. He had a nasty gash on his left calf. Once we got some distance from the pool, we stopped, and Jessie tied her jacket around it to slow the bleeding. Jessica's phone rang, startling us. "Caitlin?" she answered, placing it on speaker. A grainy FaceTime call lit up the screen. The background was dark but looked familiar. Caitlin was in the classroom closest to the entrance. "Caitlin, listen to me. You need to leave. There's some weird shit happening here," Jessie tried to explain. The connection wasn't good. The call cut out every few seconds, making it difficult to understand. Jessie, Ron, and I all tried to explain what was going on, but Caitlin clearly didn't understand. The connection continued to get worse the further into the school Caitlin got. Eventually the call dropped completely, and none of us were able to dial back out. "Jessie, you and Ron get out and go find some help. I'll find Caitlin and meet you guys on the other side." Ron tried to protest. Luckily, Jessie was able to convince him that the bleeding was too serious to continue. As we parted ways, Jessie and I agreed that if Caitlin and I weren't safely out in 15 minutes, she would call for help. "Caitlin!" I called out as I reached the front of the building. "Help!" I heard her yell frantically. I ran towards the sound and saw her. We sprinted towards each other, but she tripped over something in the process. A figure donning an archaic gas mask emerged behind her, grabbing her ankles and dragging her away. "No!" I yelled. I tried to run towards the assailant, but someone grabbed me from behind. As I tried to fight my way out, I flailed, slamming my head into the wall. I felt dizzy, and everything went dark. I saw a light. I knew what people always said about going into the light. Was this death? "She's awake," I heard. A paramedic was kneeling over me. I jumped. As I regained consciousness, I started stammering. What's going on? Where's Caitlin?" The EMT tried to calm me. My mom and Jessie were nearby. My head hurt a lot, and my arms and legs were bruised. I was transported to the hospital. That night, the only answer I could get as far as Caitlin's whereabouts was that they were looking for her. The next day, I was informed by police that Caitlin's body was found in the school. The stairs had collapsed, crushing her. I tried to tell the police about the man in the gas mask, but they clearly didn't believe me. They pretty much nodded, then had a social worker follow up with me with information on trauma counseling. What bothers me the most is that I'm not even sure Jess and Ron believe me. Something sinister is still happening in that school. I'm going back. River Oak won't take anyone else from me.